YouTube. My name is Jack. The lighting in my summer office is terrible, so I apologize for the production quality of this video. I am pre-recording this because I am going to be out of the country at the time this video goes up. It's going to be like the 1-year anniversary of my father's death, and I have other things to do. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about the word fertility as it appears in discussions of paganism in the 19th through really the mid-20th centuries. And this is a word that gets thrown around a lot in books on paganism from that period. We see it both in books by practitioners, by members of the pagan revival, talking about what they do, and in anthropological or historical works that are discussing ancient paganism. So particularly of interest for Wicca would be things like the Golden Bough or the witch cult in Western Europe. And fertility can be kind of a confusing and off-putting word when you first encounter it if you don't understand the context of how it's being used during this period. Because nowadays, when we see the word fertility, we really tend to think about like human procreation, impregnation. And so seeing pagan authors from the mid-20th century talk about, witchcraft is a fertility cult, can feel potentially alienating for people who might otherwise be interested in exploring paganism, but who are like, I don't have children, I don't want children, I'm unable to have children, any of a variety of reasons, right? Like, I'm a gay man. Human fertility, impregnation, not really my jam. But the word fertility actually has an incredibly subtle and complex context in this period from the 19th through the mid-20th centuries. And it means 3 different things. And if you don't know what to look for, if you don't know how to tease those things apart, you can read these books and think that they're talking about one thing, think that they're talking about like human making babies, when in actuality they're talking about something else entirely. So today I just wanted to talk through a little bit of what fertility can mean in these contexts, why it could mean these different things, and how to identify when it means what when people are using these words. So you actually find that in the mentions of fertility in 20th century books about paganism, particularly I'm thinking about like books by Gerald Gardner, there are 3 different uses of the word. One is making babies, that's in there. But then the other 2 are promoting fertility of crops and animals, sort of promoting agricultural fertility, success in the land. That's meaning number 2. And then meaning number 3 is that it's euphemistically used to refer to sex and sexuality and having sex. So let's break this down just a little bit. First off, let's take as an example Gerald Gardner's book, Witchcraft Today. There are 29 uses of the word fertility in this book. Of those 29 uses, I actually went through this book and documented all of them because I have nothing better to do with my time. Of those 29 uses of the word fertility, 7 are used to refer to a fertility dance. 9 are used to refer explicitly to promoting fertility in the crops. Only 1 explicitly references making babies. Well, there's a second one that talks about fertility of crops and humans, but only 1 use of the word fertility says it's about the fertility of humans and the tribe. And then you get 4 that refer to fertility as abundance, luck, or prosperity more generally. And finally, you get 8 that are ambiguous, that are unclear and could go one way or the other. Often this is just sort of a general reference to fertility rites without specifying what kind of fertility those rites are intended to produce. So right away we do see that there's a lot of emphasis on fertility in the land, right? We have more than any other category, we have references to fertility in order to bring about success of the crops and the harvest. Especially if you think about the fertility dance as referring to that, which there's good reason to believe that references to fertility dances are talking about fertility of the crops, agricultural fertility. partly because if it were about human fertility, you wouldn't be dancing, you would be doing something naughtier. But then partly also because if we look at some source material that influenced Wicca and other forms of 20th century paganism, Margaret Murray in particular spends a lot of time talking about fertility dances being performed by witches to increase or decrease the powers of the harvest. So the idea of the fertility dance is in the source material, in the things that influenced Wicca, directly connected to the crops and not to human fertility or to sort of other types of fertility like just having sex, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the primary concern, at least in witchcraft today, really is with fertility understood to be fertility in agriculture. And part of the reason for that is that early Wicca, even sort of like the thing that existed pre-Gardner, right? Whatever the New Forest Coven was doing that Gardner got initiated into, was, and I say this with love in my heart, I'm allowed to say this because I'm a Wiccan, urban people cosplaying what they imagined agrarian religion would have been like. We're at a period in English history in particular when there's this really romantic notion of like the disappearing wilds and the countryside and the primitive pagan religion of the outer folk, and all that is being lost with the advance of civilization, and oh, isn't it so tragic, and let's go back to our romantic pagan roots. So you have people who are fundamentally urban, who are coming from an urban environment, who are imagining that there is this sort of purer, more wholesome, preferable form of parochial religion from the countryside that is inherently pagan, that they're trying to recapture and reclaim. And they're constructing a religious tradition around what they imagine that parochial agrarian religion might have looked like. And so there's a lot of emphasis on witchcraft as promoting the fertility of the land, because if you buy into this myth of witches as sort of the ancient priesthood of the wild countryside and nature, then you are going to imagine that fertility of the land, promoting agriculture, crops, and livestock, and so on, is going to be a key concern of this agrarian religion that you are trying to reconstruct. So that's one of the things that fertility means in the context of discussions that you see both in an academic and practitioner's point of view throughout, sort of up through the mid-19th century, throughout the early 19th century. A lot of the time there's a real emphasis not on the fertility of people, but on the fertility of the land. And you see Doreen Valiente has in her book Witchcraft for Tomorrow, I didn't flag this quote in advance, so I won't be able to find it, but she talks a lot about the idea of sex as promoting fertility really is that, like, sex in some cases in humans can promote human fertility, and therefore sex can be sort of used as a form of sympathetic magic to promote fertility in the crops, which is the thing that really matters. So it's not a one-to-one of like, oh, witchcraft or paganism is about making babies. It's sort of this analogy of like, well, okay, we want promotion of fertility in the crops. Let's think about other things that are sort of broadly generative that we can use as an act of sympathetic magic to help promote the crops, and one of those things can be sex. We also see, once again, this is in Witchcraft Today primarily, we see a lot of conflation of fertility with prosperity, abundance, or luck in general. So there are several times where Gardner uses the word fertility just as a stand-in for abundance. He says, you want good luck, fertility, wealth, and so on. And he's lumping these things in together with the idea that, like, fertility is just a stand-in for life going well. So that's one of the things that fertility means in this context. The other one that I really want to talk about is that sometimes fertility just means sex, not even reproductive sex, but just sex. Keep in mind that up through the early Elizabethan period, Elizabethan meaning 20th century Elizabeth and not 16th century Elizabeth, up through the early Elizabethan period, you have strong restrictive sexual norms, especially in English society. That sexual counterculture really didn't emerge until the 1960s. And so you have a naked witch cult that has fairly liberal sexual norms that teaches, as long as you're not hurting anybody, do what you want to do, have all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll you want. And this is something that is really shocking and scandalous at the time. Particularly while Gerald Gardner was alive, there were all kinds of tabloid articles and paparazzi and newspapers that were, releasing these sordid stories about like naked witches practicing a depraved sex cult and so on. And that was really bad publicity. It was really bad publicity. And so a lot of the time when early witches, early members of this pagan revival wanted to talk about sex, they would couch it in terms of fertility. And they would say, we worship the life principle, and we believe that sex is holy because it is part of the life principle. And that was a way of getting around these elaborate and really constrictive ideas about sex that were popular in the culture at the time. By saying, look, yes, we are a religion that celebrates sex, but we are not a sex cult. We are celebrating the life principle, which manifests through the form of sex because of fertility, blah, 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 blah. You can pass it off as something that's a lot more respectable. And that's true not only of things that were said by witches, by practitioners, but you also find it in source material, in academic works that influenced early Wicca. And paganism more broadly. I'm talking more specifically about Wicca because obviously that's the strand of paganism that I am most involved in and familiar with, but this is true of a lot of 20th century paganism. Margaret Murray in particular has a whole section where she talks about fertility, and she does talk a little bit about the power of witches to bestow or take away human fertility, but then she goes on, and most of the rest of her section about fertility is not actually about fertility at all, it's about sex. It's about sexual rites and sexual magic. So she says, for example, in ancient times, the sacred marriage took place usually once a year. But besides this ceremony, there were other sexual rites which were not celebrated at a fixed season, but might be performed in the precincts of the temple of a god or goddess at any time, the males being often the priests or temple officials. She uses the word fertility to sort of couch when she's talking about sex, because talking about sex is gauche, and you don't it's naughty, it's dirty. You don't really want to be talking about sex. And so in a lot of scholarly discussions of fertility cults in the ancient world, the word fertility is a stand-in to sort of cover over and clothe the notion of sexuality, ritualized sexuality. And the notion that pagan societies did or might have looser sexual norms than the predominantly Christian culture of Britain in the late 19th through mid-20th centuries. So there are times where if you're reading about fertility, take a minute to just take a step back, mentally cross out the word fertility and stick in sex and see if the sentence still makes sense. Because a lot of the time if it does, what's going on is that the author is actually just talking about sex and is being coy about it. This is particularly true. I had mentioned 8 cases in Witchcraft Today where Gardner uses the word fertility and it's unclear what he is talking about. Excuse me. In all 8 of those cases, if you strip out the word fertility and drop in the word sex, it makes perfect sense. And it looks like he's just saying that witchcraft allows people to be sexual. So I think that's just important context to have if you're beginning to venture into paganism, particularly if you're reading early books in paganism, if you're reading source materials, which anyone who is familiar with this channel knows that I love my source materials. The Meaning of Witchcraft, by the way, by Gerald Gardner, also has sort of the same level of breakdown of talking mostly about fertility of crops or fertility dances. some occasions of talking about luck and prosperity, a few cases that are very ambiguous that could go either way, but that I think make the most sense if you just read them as talking about sex. And then, like, just a couple of places where he explicitly talks about human babies. But it's really not the focus of either of these books. But anyway, I think if you're coming into paganism and it's new to you and you're trying to figure out if this is a religious sort of umbrella that you want to belong to, if your life isn't all about making babies, which for most of us, even for those of us who have children, we aren't usually like predominantly focused on the making of babies. We have lives. It can potentially be confusing or off-putting to see the word fertility appearing in all these contexts if you don't know what it means. So I think having that breakdown of understanding that when the word fertility appears, sometimes, very rarely actually, it does refer to humans having babies. But most of the time, it's talking either about this sort of pseudo-agrarian revival of an imagined religion focused on crops and livestock, or it's code for we're talking about sex, but we don't want to use the word sex because it's dirty. I think that can clarify a lot of what's going on in these early books that talk about paganism, and that really shaped a lot of modern ideas about paganism. So that's all I wanted for today. I will leave it off here. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you sometime soon.